Spider-Man may officially and legally belong to Sony Pictures, but culturally Spider-Man belongs to everyone, which is why everybody will have a unique vision of what that character is and how they see him, or in some cases maybe her, or in other cases maybe even them. Now, I've already talked a bit about my ideal Spider-Man, the young wallflower Peter Parker growing up in the early 1960s with his overcompensating aunt and uncle, a bitter young outcast with fantasies of fame and fortune, who learns too late to put his own ego aside, and that with great power there must also come great responsibility. If you want further elaboration on my vision of Spider-Man, his world, and my kind of motion picture idea, you can check out my previous video, How I Would Reboot Spider-Man. And I've had a lot of people asking me to do a sequel. And while I don't have a sequel in mind, I would like to continue to reinvent Spider-Man. Let's reimagine this world a little further, and I'm going to start with a villain in this video. And the villain I have chosen for this one is Electro. So do keep in mind that this version of Electro I'll be talking about in this video is my own version that would fit in with the version of Spider-Man and New York City that I set up in my How I Would Reboot Spider-Man video. This Electro would face that version of Spider-Man, although I do think he's relatively adaptable. Get it? Because he's Electro and you need an adapter? Sorry, I'm making the terrible electrical puns so that he doesn't have to. Right, so before we go into the powers, the practicality, the costume, you gotta remember the most important thing about these is the characters. You don't just want some mustache-twirling guy that wants to take over the world using electric powers, or in other cases, this blue light bulb man that makes electrical puns and fixes a gap between his teeth using electric eels. My goal here wasn't to modernize Electro, and it wasn't to just pull him out of the comic books either. My idea here was to take Electro and make him vintage. Because that's what my whole view of Spider-Man is he's a vintage comic book character. He's a vintage superhero. Gosh, that's just another word that... You ever notice how weird of a word that is to actually say? Vintage. Like... I don't know, I keep getting this, where I say a certain word and then I think of it in isolation, just think, that's a weird word. Vintage. Huh. So, let's start off with Max Dillon. Max Dillon is commonly portrayed as a bit of a young, rebellious upstart in many cases. He's often portrayed as kind of a crook, a rebel, you know, someone who's kind of, in some ways, a little bit of a match for Spider-Man personality-wise. Got kind of a goofball thing going on with him. And he's also the only Spider-Man villain that I believe, I might be mistaken here, but I believe is canonically bisexual. His villain power is shooting electricity out of his hands, and his origin story was that he was like an electrician, and he was trying to fix some electricity when zap, now he's Electro. I'm sure this has been expanded upon in later stories that I haven't read, but I've always been basing my vision of Spider-Man entirely off of the Steve Ditko era of Spider-Man comics because that's the Spider-Man that I'm all about. And to be honest, we're not really provided with much to work with there, which is one of the things I love about those Ditko comics, is that the villains' actual personalities are not entirely fleshed out yet, allowing a lot of room for interpretation. Whereas with Batman villains, there tends to be a little more to them at an earlier stage. With Spider-Man villains, the imagination is clearly there in their personas. But I kind of want an Electro that feels a little bit distinct from some of Spidey's other villains. I don't want him to be this young upstart rebel. My view of Electro is that this all takes place in the 1960s, and at this stage, at this point in time, Max Dillon is in his mid-60s. So he's kind of a man of a bygone era. The 60s is a time of a lot of change, a lot of freedom of expression, and Maxwell Dillon has grown up in another time. So he doesn't like to be called Max. He likes to be called Maxwell. He wants to be respected. And he works as an electrical engineer. He reads the Daily Bugle, he knows about Spider-Man, which he just believes is propaganda. He just believes the whole superhero thing is absolute poppycock. His whole verdict is that no one can truly have superpowers, and no one can truly have any kind of power, to be honest. Astutely grumbling about hierarchy. He works as an electrical engineer tradesman for a company called Strand Electricals, and Maxwell is 10 years older than his boss, Carlton Strand. His denial of the hierarchy is really just a coping mechanism for the fact that he's very insecure about the fact that his boss is 10 years younger than he is. It's something he struggles to comprehend. He believes in kind of like a pecking order sort of a system. Old school, respect your elders, but he kind of carries himself with this, management, schmanagement, no one really has power sort of an attitude, which carries over to his view on superheroes. So he's a very insecure and paranoid guy, paranoid of times changing changing. But to make matters worse, his marriage has lost its spark. It's hollow. Get it? Spark? Ha 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 ha! And there is kind of a reason for that. See, Maxwell is a Christian, living in a 1960s world at age 65 approximately, and he would like nothing more than to jump the bones of his manager Carlton Strand. He is desperately in love with him, just as much as he resents him. So Maxwell is pretty all over the place. He's an old man whose life has not really gone as he wanted it to. He's a backward-minded, bitter old guy. So kind of making a mockery of the whole superhero propaganda thing, he starts just playing with his electrical tools and be like, look at me, I'm Electro, I'm a superhero. And he legitimately finds a way of shooting electricity out of the gloves on his hands using a generator on his backpack, which eventually turns into a curiosity about electricity, which eventually turns into a fetish for electricity, with his abuse of electricity almost becoming equivalent to like, I don't know, like BDSM as far as he's concerned. I mean, you gotta think, he's a repressed bisexual in the 1960s. When it comes to his erotic fantasies, he's gonna need some kind of an outlet. You get it? Electricity! And then fetishism eventually turns into addiction, and thus Electro is born. Because of the time this is set and what kind of a thinker Maxwell is, he would rather go into a life of crime than actually acknowledge and explore his own bisexuality. So Electro kind of starts working for gangs as kind of hired muscle, and eventually kind of works his way up the crime ladder to kind of becoming his own thing, eventually in the process killing Carlton Strand out of his own sense of denial. And because of all this, he kind of feels a bit more at peace with himself now, because he's no longer got this boss that's 10 years below him. And as far as he's concerned, he's now at the top of the New York food chain. So he can finally get out of this sense of denial of the hierarchy just because of his own insecurities. As far as Maxwell is concerned, Maxwell is gone. He's been reborn as Electro and is now living the life he was supposed to live all along. Of course, this is just a very warped perspective on it. What we have here is kind of acceptance that Maxwell is a monster, but maybe a monster is what he was born to be all along. Now, naturally, Spidey catches wind of this, he helps defeat Electro, and as Spidey webs up Electro, Electro basically comes out with a bunch of different excuses as to why he is the way he is and why he's right. Why years of self-repression have turned him into this. Why he believes that he was a monster all along and he's just fulfilling his destiny. Now, Spider-Man, being the forward-thinking teenager, would say, you're not a monster for that. Maxwell wasn't a monster for his life feeling unfulfilled. Maxwell wasn't a monster for his bisexual urges, and he can't blame who he is now onto that. He can't just use the world that he lives in and his age as an excuse. So Spider-Man wouldn't take any sympathy for his sob story. We would establish that Spidey and a few of his friends at Midtown High do have pretty forward-thinking mindsets towards attitudes towards things like homosexuality early on in the film, after rumors would spread that 2 of the football players at Midtown High were caught kissing, turning them into pariahs, kinda establishing that Spider-Man doesn't really care what a person's sexuality is. At the end of the day, he was a teenager in the 1960s, which was a time when freedom of expression was really kind of a big deal. Attitudes were changing towards things like this, but Spidey wouldn't just let Maxwell use that as an excuse. He's aware that there is no politics to what Electro is doing, no political or social excuse to what he's doing. If you're a guy going out and committing crimes using an electrical generator to shoot lightning out of your hands to harm people, there is no sub-story that's gonna make that okay. So the moral of the story is don't be a dick, which is basically the moral of every superhero story to a degree. Okay, so in terms of Electro's outfit, you gotta remember he's kind of making a mockery of superheroes using resources that he actually has. But I still want this to feel kinda like comic book Electro. The base of Electro's general costume would come in the form of rubber safety gear from his job. So he'd have kind of like a green muted hazmat suit with a black balaclava that he wears to protect his face. He'd have a big pair of yellow safety goggles on with like yellow elastic straps that stretch across the back of his head from all different angles, kind of making that sort of electric shape that Electro has on his head. Now, Electro would of course have a backpack generator on, and around the straps of that generator would be yellow and green earth wires sort of wrapped around around those straps to kind of make the sort of zigzag yellow patterns that Electro does have going down his torso. As well as that, he'd also have those wires sort of draped around his sleeves as well, connecting up to his gloves, which would be thick black gloves, rubber ones to avoid, conducting electricity or anything like that, but with sort of like metal tips. And he would have this sort of console of retro switches on his chest going across the two straps of the generator on his back, which can allow him to sort of change and tune his electricity, change the range of it. A very sort of practical look that still kinda resembles Electro from the comics, but does it in kind of a modern, practical way. I definitely wanted to keep that yellow and green color scheme, because I think that's so clever, because it's like an earth wire. Now, currently in mind for this role, I have Ian Glenn. I feel like he could really pull off this version of Electro really well, and deliver a really creepy performance. But if you guys have actor suggestions, do let me know in the comments below. But most importantly, what do you guys think? Comment below and discuss, and as always, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, don't forget to hit subscribe, hit the like button, and in the description below are links to my Patreon and my Discord. I really want to make this like an ongoing thing of imagining different Spider-Man villains. So if you do have any suggestions, please do comment them below. This video is brought to you by Zentai for all your cosplay needs. Link is in the description below, and they are very cool and good. Cosplay your favorite characters or send in one of your own designs. Affordable prices and very high quality. Made to order and made to measure. But most of all, made to be heckin' awesome, if you couldn't already tell. Guys, can you believe where we are now and where we started? How long ago it was that Channel Pup, or Channel Go even, came about? Because it really wasn't that long when you think about it. Can you believe the amount of support I've received from this community, from all of you subscribing to the channel and everything? It's unreal. It's a dream come true for me. But behind the YouTubers you watch usually comes a bit of a truth, is that they're often dirt poor. Now, I've had the good fortune of being able to grow this YouTube channel and hopefully turn it into a career, but I'm gonna need a little bit of help along the way to even the odds, to make ends meet, so that I can use all of the possible time that I have to make videos for you guys, as opposed to doing something mundane for barely enough money to make it worth its while. I've done all that. I've lived that life. The fact is, together we all built Channel Pup. We made it what it is today, and I want to keep the ball rolling on that. I don't ever want to stop doing this, because this is the most gratifying job I've ever had, and I think the most pleasurable hobby anyone could ever have. I don't take any of the support that I receive from you guys for granted, but if in any way you're wondering if maybe you could do a little more for the channel even, then I want to direct you to the Patreon link in the description below. It would mean the world to me to have your support via Patreon. It can help me to make ends meet. It can help me to better my content. It can help me to have more time to really work on this stuff. But you know what? I'm not just going to take your support and run. No way, Jose. In the Patreon, you can access exclusive videos via the Pups Project Room playlist, where you can see different projects that I've been working on or have worked on that have either not made it to YouTube for general viewing or have been cancelled, or, well, you can get a little view of the process that goes behind the Channel Pup videos and productions. As well as that, you tend to get advanced previews of the bigger Channel Pup projects, our tentpole event projects. If you've seen Marvelous Tales of Spider-Man, you'll be aware that that was released on the Patreon first, and 20 days later approximately was released for general viewing on YouTube. That's not the only time I'm gonna do this. But you know what? If you can't do the Patreon, or are just not interested in doing the Patreon, I fully understand. Like, it's still a big ask in my opinion. And what counts most is your support. So, as always, thank you so much, guys. I've been Channel Pup, and I will think of a better catchphrase next time. Now, please leave me alone!